Hello, esteemed gentlemen. Beware the quiet man, for while others speak, he watches, and while others act, he plans, and when they finally rest, he strikes. There's an old saying that goes, "Still waters run deep." But what they don't tell you is that sometimes those waters aren't just deep, they're bottomless, dark, and filled with things no one saw coming. Psychologists say that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who explode in anger, but the ones who stay silent, collecting every slight, every insult, every push, until the moment they decide enough is enough. And that's where our story begins. He was just the quiet one, the guy in the background, the one they overlooked, underestimated, and, worst of all, pushed too far. They thought he was harmless, boring, passive, but they forgot one crucial detail. A Sigma male doesn't bark, he doesn't whine, he doesn't seek attention, he simply watches. And when the time comes, he moves. By the time they realize what's happening, it's already too late. So buckle up, because this isn't just another story about some mysterious lone wolf. This is the cold, brutal truth about what happens when a man who never wanted a war finally decides to fight one. Number 1. The fatal underdog effect. They never saw him coming. He was the quiet one, the one nobody paid attention to. They dismissed him as insignificant, just another background character in their story. They took his silence as weakness, his patience as passivity. He wasn't in their circles, wasn't part of their games, and so, in their minds, he didn't matter. But that's the thing about underdogs, the ones who don't seek validation, the ones who don't beg for a seat at the table. They are the most dangerous, because while the world is busy looking past them, they are busy becoming something else entirely. At first they mock him, they throw their insults, their little digs, expecting him to break, to react, to prove he's affected. He doesn't, he absorbs it all. Not because he's weak, but because he knows the rules of the game better than they do. He knows that power isn't in shouting back, isn't in demanding respect. It's in becoming something that can't be denied. The more they push him down, the sharper he gets, the more unshakable he becomes. Every failure, every rejection, every setback is fuel. He doesn't just endure, he evolves. Then, without warning, the shift happens. The quiet nobody turns into the unstoppable force. The ones who ridiculed him suddenly realize they're standing in his shadow. The ones who dismissed him now watch as he builds something beyond their reach. The same people who thought they were better, now scrambling to catch up. They were so convinced he was a loser, they never considered he was simply preparing for a victory far bigger than they could ever imagine. And the most brutal part, he doesn't even care about proving them wrong. He moves forward without looking back. While they're stuck in their small, competitive world, still trying to one-up each other, he's operating on a level they can't even comprehend. They don't matter to him anymore. They never really did. The fatal underdog effect isn't just about the rise, it's about the aftermath. The stunned silence, the regret, the realization that they never should have underestimated him, but by then it's too late. He's already won. Number 2. The quiet genius syndrome. They always assumed he was just quiet, just different, just a little odd. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, wasn't the one constantly proving himself, so they wrote him off. What they never realized was that his silence wasn't emptiness, it was precision. While they spoke just to be heard, he was observing, analyzing, breaking everything down to its core. He saw the flaws in their logic, the gaps in their confidence, the contradictions in their beliefs. He was playing a completely different game, and the irony? They never even knew he was playing. The quiet genius syndrome isn't about being a misunderstood prodigy. It's about being someone who doesn't need recognition to know his own value. He doesn't waste energy forcing people to acknowledge him. He doesn't explain himself to those who can't keep up. He simply learns, builds, and refines until he's so far ahead that by the time they start asking questions, he has already moved on. He doesn't need to be told he's right. He sees the results in real time. The world takes longer to catch up, and by the time it does, he's already on to the next thing. They mock what they don't understand. They think he's awkward, think he's slow, think he's lacking something. Meanwhile, he's watching them repeat the same mistakes, chasing trends he predicted would collapse. clinging to illusions he saw through years ago. He isn't detached because he doesn't care. He's detached because most people have nothing valuable to offer him. He would rather sit in silence than waste his time on pointless conversations, rather be alone than surrounded by people who mistake noise for intelligence. Then one day, the shift happens. The same people who dismissed him are suddenly looking in his direction. The skills they mocked, now essential. The mindset they misunderstood, now enviable. The world starts valuing what he's always had, but he no longer values their approval. They are chasing something he mastered long ago. They want guidance, insight, a piece of whatever it is that makes him different, but he's already too far ahead. They never saw it coming, and now they never will. Number 3. The hidden predator instinct. They thought he was harmless. Too quiet, too indifferent, too detached to ever be a real threat. He didn't throw his weight around, didn't flex, didn't compete for dominance. To them, he was invisible. But invisibility is power when it's a choice. They never stopped to wonder why he moved the way he did, why he never reacted to petty challenges, why he never felt the need to prove himself. He wasn't avoiding conflict, he was studying it. He wasn't weak, he was waiting. People assume predators are the loudest ones, the ones who show aggression, who demand respect through force. But the most dangerous ones aren't chasing attention. They blend in, they observe, they let others expose their own weaknesses. He learned early that the world rewards the ruthless, but punishes those who show their teeth too soon. So he adapted. He became the one no one saw coming. They pushed, thinking there was nothing underneath. They provoked, thinking he had no bite. They confused patience with fear, silence with submission. But restraint is not the absence of power, it is the control of it. And when that control is released, it isn't reckless, it's devastating. When he finally decides to strike, it isn't an explosion of rage or an impulsive outburst. It's precise, calculated, surgical. He doesn't fight for ego, he eliminates obstacles. He doesn't argue for validation. He dismantles threats. By the time they realize who he really is, it's over. The ones who underestimated him are left in shock, questioning everything. How did they not see it? How did they miss the signs? But there were no signs. That's what made him lethal. While they wasted time showing off, he spent his time sharpening his instincts. While they were obsessed with looking strong, he became something worse, unpredictable. And unpredictability isn't just dangerous, it's terrifying. They thought he was just another quiet man on the sidelines, but when the moment came, they learned the truth. He wasn't just watching, he was hunting. And when he finally moved, there was nothing they could do to stop him. Number 4. Forced to wear the mask. He was never one of them, but he knew how to blend in. He had to. The world doesn't tolerate those who refuse to play along, so he learned the rules, not to follow them, but to use them. He wore the mask, said the right things, played the part they expected. They thought they knew him. Thought he was just another face in the crowd, another man trying to fit in. But the mask wasn't for his protection. It was for theirs. Because if they ever saw what was underneath, they wouldn't know how to handle it. He watched as people lied to themselves, convinced themselves they were in control, that their carefully constructed identities were real. He saw the contradictions, the fragile egos hidden behind loud voices, the desperation behind false confidence. They lived for approval, terrified of being cast out, terrified of not being seen. That fear controlled them, shaped them, kept them obedient. But he was different. He didn't need their approval, didn't crave their validation. He played their game, but he never forgot that it was just that, a game. Over time, the mask became a prison. He spoke their language, but it wasn't his. He followed their customs, but they meant nothing to him. He laughed at their jokes, but felt nothing inside. He realized that the more he played along, the more they expected him to stay. They weren't just fooled, they were comfortable. They believed he was one of them, and in their minds that meant he could never be more than them. They mistook his patience for acceptance, his silence for submission. They never stopped to ask if he was truly one of them, because the truth would have been too unsettling. Then, one day, he let it slip, just for a moment. The real him, the mind behind the mask, the force they had never noticed. And in that moment he saw the shift, the hesitation, the discomfort, the flicker of fear. They didn't know what to do with him. They never had. He wasn't like them, and now they finally understood. But by then, it didn't matter. He was done pretending. Number 5. Exiled by choice, feared by default. He never belonged, and he never tried to. The world made it clear early on. He wasn't one of them. He didn't follow their trends, didn't laugh at their jokes, didn't crave their approval. So they did what they always do to those they don't understand. They kept him at a distance, treating him like an outsider, never fully accepting him. What they didn't realize was that he preferred it that way. They thought they were excluding him, but in reality he was excusing himself. He watched from the outside, seeing the things they couldn't, the way they constantly sought validation, the way they built their identities on shallow foundations, the way they lived in fear of being forgotten. They clung to each other, not out of loyalty, but out of fear of being alone. Their friendships were just transactions, their relationships just distractions. They called it connection, but he saw it for what it was: dependency. And he wanted no part of it. Over time, they began to notice something unsettling. He didn't need them. He moved through life on his own terms, unbothered by their acceptance, unaffected by their rejections. While they fought to be seen, he thrived in the shadows. While they sought security in numbers, he became unbreakable in solitude. And that's when the fear set in, because a man who doesn't need the tribe is a man they can't control. They whispered about him, speculated, tried to label him as bitter, arrogant, broken. They needed to believe something was wrong with him because the alternative was too disturbing, that he had figured out something they hadn't, that their world, their structure, their so-called society wasn't necessary. He had built his own, one they couldn't touch, one they couldn't influence, and that's what scared them the most. They could exile him, but they couldn't weaken him. They could reject him, but they couldn't break him. He didn't just survive without them, he thrived, and deep down they knew that if the roles were reversed, they wouldn't last a day in his world. Number 6. The fear of the man who doesn't fear loss. They could never understand him, and that terrified them. He wasn't reckless, but he also wasn't afraid, not of losing, not of failure, not of being alone. He moved through life with a kind of detachment that unsettled people. They held on tightly to their possessions, their reputations, their carefully constructed identities. He didn't. Not because he didn't value things, but because he had already accepted that everything in life could be taken away. He didn't live in denial of that fact. He embraced it. And that made him dangerous. Most people are easy to control because they're afraid. Afraid of being humiliated, afraid of losing money, afraid of being rejected. They compromise, they submit, they play by rules they don't even believe in just to avoid risk. He was different. He had already lost before, had already been through the fire, and instead of breaking, he became something else, someone who no longer feared the fall. He had walked through his worst days and came out the other side. That meant there was nothing left they could use against him. They tried to threaten him, but threats only work on people who have something to protect. They tried to shame him, but shame only works on people desperate for approval. They tried to isolate him, but solitude was his natural state. Every weapon they used against him was useless, and that's when the realization hit. There was no way to control a man like him. He couldn't be manipulated, couldn't be pressured, couldn't be swayed by the things that ruled everyone else. That kind of man isn't just intimidating, he's a nightmare. Because when someone has no fear of loss, they become truly free. Free to walk away from anything that doesn't serve them. Free to take risks others wouldn't dare. Free to move through life on their own terms without hesitation, without compromise. And that's why they feared him. Not because he was violent, not because he was cruel, but because he was untouchable. They needed their power to mean something. He had already decided it didn't. And in that moment they realized they had nothing left to hold over him. Number 7. The moment he becomes ruthless. There's a moment when something inside him shifts. It doesn't come with a loud explosion, not with screaming or wild aggression. It's quieter than that, colder, a point of no return. He spends years enduring, observing, calculating, letting things slide, not because he's weak, but because he knows most battles aren't worth fighting. He lets them think they've won, lets them feel superior. He doesn't waste his energy proving himself to people who don't matter, until the day comes when they make a mistake they can't take back. It could be betrayal, an insult that cuts too deep, an attack that goes too far, something that crosses a line they never even knew existed. And that's when the change happens. The patience he once had, gone. The mercy he once gave, no longer an option. The man they underestimated, the one they laughed at, the one they thought would never strike back, finally does, but not in the way they expect. He doesn't lash out in a fit of rage. He doesn't lose control. Instead, he becomes something terrifying, ruthless. His moves become precise, calculated, surgical. He doesn't just fight back, he dismantles. He doesn't just teach a lesson, he makes sure it's never forgotten. He had the power all along, but they mistook his restraint for weakness. Now, they learn the truth. The only reason they got away with anything before was because he allowed it. And now, he doesn't. The most chilling part is that he feels nothing, no anger, no guilt, no hesitation. The emotions that might have once held him back are dead. All that's left is clarity, the understanding that some people only learn when there's no other choice. And so he gives them exactly that. By the time they realize what's happening, it's too late. They aren't facing the man they used to mock or underestimate. That version of him is gone. What's left is someone they never should have provoked, someone who no longer cares about fairness, someone who understands that in a world full of predators, the only way to survive is to become something worse. Number 8. Revenge? No. Absolute erasure. They expected anger. They expected revenge. A heated response, a reckless outburst, something they could see coming and prepare for. But he doesn't give them that. He never does what they expect. That's what makes him different, what makes him dangerous. He doesn't settle for payback. He makes sure there's nothing left to come back from. Revenge is personal, emotional, messy. It's what weak men do when they still care, when they still want to prove something. He's past that. He doesn't need satisfaction, doesn't need closure. He only needs one thing, erasure. He doesn't just return the blow. He removes the problem entirely. He makes it so they don't just regret what they did. They regret ever crossing paths with him in the first place. He doesn't shout, doesn't warn, doesn't give them time to prepare. He moves in silence, dismantling everything they took for granted, their security, their confidence, their ability to ever stand in his way again, and by the time they realize what's happening, the damage is already done. There's no undoing it, no fixing it, no crawling back to how things used to be. They don't just lose, they cease to matter. That's the part they never saw coming. They thought they were dealing with someone who would fight fair, someone who would meet them on their level, someone who wanted to play the same game. But he doesn't play games. He ends them. He doesn't do second chances, doesn't give warnings, doesn't leave room for redemption. He eliminates threats completely. And the worst part, he never looks back. He doesn't dwell, doesn't celebrate, doesn't even acknowledge them after it's done. He moves on as if they never existed, and that's what destroys them the most. Not just the loss, but the realization that in the end, they were nothing. They were a temporary nuisance, an inconvenience, a mistake that got corrected. They thought they could take something from him. They thought they could break him, humiliate him, weaken him. Instead, they made the ultimate mistake. They made themselves a problem. And problems don't get revenge, they get erased. Number 9. The psychological scar he leaves on his enemies. They thought it would be over once the damage was done. That time would pass, wounds would heal, and life would go back to normal. But they didn't understand him. They didn't realize that what he leaves behind isn't just destruction. It's a scar. A psychological wound that never fully fades, a presence that lingers long after he's gone. He doesn't just defeat his enemies, he changes them. He forces them to see themselves for what they really are. Weak, predictable, powerless. He doesn't just strip them of their pride, their illusions, their sense of control. He forces them to live with the knowledge that they never really had any power in the first place. And once a man sees that truth, he can never unsee it. It starts as doubt, a hesitation they never used to have, a second-guessing that wasn't there before. They find themselves looking over their shoulder, wondering if he's still watching. wondering if he still has one more move left. Because that's the thing. He doesn't just strike once and walk away. He makes sure they feel his presence even in his absence. Every decision they make from that point forward is tainted by the memory of him. They see his face in every threat, hear his words in every moment of self-doubt. His silence becomes louder than their own thoughts. They remember the way he never flinched, never hesitated, never lost control. They remember the feeling of standing in front of him and realizing, too late, that they were nothing, that they had picked a fight they could never win. And worst of all, they remember the way he moved on without them. No hatred, no lingering grudge, no need to continue the fight. Because they never mattered enough to hold his attention. They weren't an opponent, they were an obstacle. And obstacles aren't remembered for long. But they remember him. They carry his presence like a shadow, long after he's gone. Because he didn't just break them, he rewired them. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how much they try to move forward, they will never truly be free of him. Number 10. The day they realize he was right all along. They mocked him, dismissed him, ignored his words like they were nothing. He wasn't loud enough, wasn't aggressive enough, wasn't the kind of man they thought deserved attention. They believed he was just another outsider with opinions that didn't matter. They laughed at his warnings, rolled their eyes at his insights, brushed off his perspective as if it was worthless. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't need validation. It doesn't beg to be heard. It waits. And then, one by one, they started to fall. The same people who called him paranoid, cynical, or detached suddenly found themselves drowning in the very chaos he predicted. The social structures they clung to crumbled. The people they trusted turned on them. The things they thought were secure vanished overnight. Everything they once took for granted collapsed, and in the wreckage, a bitter realization crept in. He was right. But by then, it was too late. They had already pushed him away, ignored him, treated him like a fool. Now, they wanted his guidance, his wisdom, his understanding of the game they had never truly seen. They looked for him, hoping he would still be there, hoping he would offer them a way out. But he was gone. Not out of anger, not out of pettiness, but because he had no reason to stay. He warned them, he tried, and they chose to ignore him. That was their mistake. Regret set in, but regret wouldn't save them. They wished they had listened, wished they had taken him seriously, wished they hadn't been so blind. But wishing changes nothing. They had laughed at him when they had the luxury of arrogance. Now, standing in the ruins of their own choices, there was no laughter left. And him? He didn't gloat. He didn't come back to rub it in. That's not who he was. He simply continued forward, untouched, unbothered, unconcerned with their suffering. Because in the end, it wasn't about proving himself to them. He never needed their approval. He had already won the moment they realized he was right. And that victory, unlike theirs, would last forever. Number 11. The ultimate Sigma paradox. He is the contradiction they can't wrap their heads around. A man who doesn't fit into their categories, who moves in ways they can't predict, who exists outside the rules they blindly follow. He's alone but never lonely, detached but never lost, silent but never weak. They can't figure him out, and that's what makes him impossible to control. They assume every man wants what they want, status, validation, a place in the hierarchy. But he doesn't. He walks away from the very things they spend their lives chasing. He doesn't fight for a seat at the table because he doesn't want to sit with them in the first place. He doesn't seek power over others because he has already mastered himself. That's what makes him dangerous. A man with no external desires is a man with nothing to manipulate. They try to label him, but no label fits. He's not a leader, not a follower. He's not driven by revenge, not fueled by approval. He can be ruthless, yet he never seeks conflict. He can be compassionate, yet he never begs for acceptance. He understands people better than they understand themselves, yet remains a mystery to everyone who meets him. His presence unsettles them because it forces them to question everything they believe. How can a man be so unaffected by their games? How can he thrive without alliances, without validation, without playing by the same rules? They watch him, hoping to find a weakness, a crack in the foundation. But all they find is a man who is perfectly at peace in his solitude, perfectly confident in his choices, perfectly indifferent to their judgments. That's the paradox. They see him as an enigma, but to him, the truth is simple. He isn't bound by the illusions that trap everyone else. He doesn't waste energy pretending to be something he's not. He moves, he adapts, he survives on his own terms. And while they struggle to understand him, he never wastes a second trying to explain. He doesn't need to be understood. He just needs to keep moving. Number 12. Women realize too late. At first, they overlooked him. He wasn't the loudest, wasn't the one fighting for attention, wasn't the one trying to impress. He didn't play the game, didn't chase them, didn't fall into the patterns they were used to, and that made them dismiss him. In a world full of men constantly proving themselves, he was the one who didn't bother. That was their first mistake. They gravitated toward the predictable, the ones who put them on a pedestal, the ones who fed their need for validation. They mistook his silence for disinterest, his independence for weakness, his lack of effort as proof that he wasn't worth their time. They wanted excitement, drama, control. He gave them none of it. So they looked elsewhere, chasing what felt like power, mistaking attention for value. But time has a way of revealing truth. The men they chose, the ones who had seemed so charming, so confident, so perfect in the moment, turned out to be fragile, insecure, disappointing. The same ones who once showered them with affection became needy, desperate, lost. The illusion shattered, and when it did, they started to see him differently. He hadn't changed. He was the same man he had always been. But now they saw the strength in his quiet nature, the power in his detachment, the mystery in his self-sufficiency. They realized he wasn't cold, he was simply selective. He wasn't weak, he just never needed to prove himself. And suddenly the very things they ignored about him became the things they craved. But by then, it was too late. He had already moved on, already left them behind, already continued his path without a second thought. He didn't hold grudges, didn't seek revenge, didn't waste energy on what could have been. He simply saw the truth, that they were never meant for him in the first place. And that's what haunted them. Not just the regret, not just the realization of what they had lost, but the knowledge that he was never coming back. They had their chance, and they wasted it. Now all they could do was watch as he disappeared from their world forever. He was never meant to fit in. He was never meant to be understood, accepted, or controlled. From the beginning, he walked a path that few had the strength to take, alone, unshaken, unburdened by the need for approval. They mistook his silence for insignificance, his patience for weakness, his detachment for emptiness. But they were wrong. He was never weak, never lost, never lesser. He was simply waiting for the moment when the world would expose itself, for the moment when truth would break through illusion, for the moment when they would finally see him for what he truly was. And when that moment came, it wasn't with a grand display or a dramatic confrontation. It was subtle, irreversible, undeniable. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to seek revenge, to demand recognition, to beg for what was already his. They came to their own realization in their own time, and by then the damage had already been done. The people who underestimated him learned the cost of their ignorance. The ones who dismissed him found themselves wishing for another chance. The ones who betrayed him discovered that some losses are permanent. But he never looked back. That was the difference. While they spent their time regretting, reflecting, and trying to undo the past, he simply moved forward. That was his greatest power. Not strength, not intelligence, not ruthlessness, but his ability to let go without hesitation, to erase, to rebuild, to walk away from what no longer served him without a second thought. He left them with scars, with memories, with the echoes of a man they would never truly understand. And in the end, that was his victory. Not the destruction, not the revenge, not the fear he left behind. His victory was his freedom. He had no chains, no regrets, no attachments to anything that did not deserve him. He was exactly what they never saw coming. Unstoppable, untouchable, unforgettable. By the time they realized who he was already gone. And that is why he will never be replaced, never be replicated, never be forgotten. If this resonated with you, if you see the truth in these words, then don't just walk away, take action. Subscribe to the channel to stay ahead of the game. Like the video to show your support. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and share this with those who need to hear it. Only those who seek truth will understand. Keep moving forward.